Hey there, ladies and gents. Chris here, and I have just completed your Christmas present for this year, which is my latest holiday tale of Metamor City. It's called A Wizard Family Solstice, and for the next 3 nights, I'm going to read you guys the 3 parts of this story. So, this is... always tell you guys that I'm giving you fresh new fiction, and this is the freshest, newest fiction that I have ever brought you. So, here is A Wizard Family Solstice, a holiday tale of Metamor City. And you're getting this live with no edits. Part 1. The Gift Shop of the Magi. John Tunstall awoke, as usual, at 5 a.m. He turned off his alarm clock, stumbled muzzily to the bathroom, and attended to the morning necessities, still half asleep. He pulled on a fresh black t-shirt. The text on the front read, "Let me drop everything and work on your problem," and a slightly less fresh pair of jeans, then wandered to the kitchen. After making coffee and snatching a quick breakfast of leftovers from the fridge, he headed downstairs. He crossed through the warehouse, into the shop, down an aisle lined with knickknacks and another filled with candles, and finally to the front door. He flipped around the sign in the window, unlocked the deadbolt, and stepped outside to see where the door led to today. He exited onto one of the middle levels in a vertical shopping mall. At least a dozen stories stretched above and below him, connected by a series of zigzagging escalators and at least 4 glass-enclosed lifts. The ceilings of every level were festooned with twinkling holiday lights, and oversized decorations resembling ornaments and snowflakes hung in the spaces between the escalators. Most of the shops weren't open yet, so the holiday shopping crowds had not yet arrived, but John saw a few elderly folks slowly circling the building, taking their climate-controlled morning walk. John turned around and looked at his own storefront. The sign read, "Holiday Treasures," in a kitschy font that looked like the letters were made of candy canes. Solstice-themed decorations and gift ideas filled the window displays, almost completely blocking any view of the shop's interior. Nowhere was the shop's actual name in evidence. Spells 4U had always been a terrible name for a store, in John's opinion, but in the last 8 months it had gone from being merely inadvisable to actually dangerous. Which is what happens, John thought sourly, when you pick a fight with the Imperial Minister of Intelligence. Going back inside, John found a plug attached to the set of holiday lights in the window displays. He dutifully plugged them in, then went behind the counter to start up the register and straighten up the jewelry cases. About half an hour later, his boss wandered down from the apartment, a mug of tea in one hand and a buttered muffin in the other. As usual, the old man wore a dark blue robe covered with bright yellow cartoon stars and crescent moons, with a matching cone-shaped hat and a pair of fuzzy slippers. His frizzy white hair and beard were both freshly washed and combed, which made him look slightly less disreputable than usual. His pale blue eyes scanned the jewelry cases as he passed them, his shopkeeper's intuition weighing the placement and presentation of each bauble. He glanced briefly up at John, who stood head and shoulders above him, and made a sound of grudging approval. "You're getting better at that," he said, in the thick Southmorean brogue John was never entirely sure was genuine. "I'm glad to see you're applying that brain of yours to more than your magic lessons." John raised his eyebrows. A compliment? First thing in the morning? He thought. Either the holiday spirit's gotten to him, or the old man wants something. John was pretty sure he knew the answer. People who worked in retail didn't get holiday cheer. Holiday murder fantasies, possibly, but not cheer. Thanks, John said warily. Can I get you anything, boss? 10 minutes of peace and quiet will do nicely, Master Tunstall. The shopkeeper settled himself into the chair behind the register with a grunt of effort. He sipped his tea and looked out at the window display, his expression clouded. John had been working with his master long enough to know that look. He's seen something that's bothering him. The old man was one of the best seers on the planet, and he had lived his life amidst a perpetual whirlwind of prophetic insights. What most people didn't know about him, not even the regular customers who knew him best, was that he had almost no control over these visions. He lived in a whirlwind of warring timelines, where past, present, and possible futures intermingled and overlapped, as if a series of video feeds had been spliced together by a music video director on psychedelics. On the one hand, this made him precognizant to a degree that astonished even other wizards. On the other hand, the disorientation it created could be debilitating. This was the reason the old man almost never left his shop. By staying in a confined, familiar space that was under his complete control, he could limit the number and variety of the encounters he would face in a day. This kept the barrage of potential futures down to a manageable number. Most days in the shop were not too different from most others, so within these constraints, he could almost function like a normal human being. Unless, of course, something especially unusual or disruptive was about to happen. John left the master to his thoughts and went to see to the other duties around the shop. He restocked the shelves where they were depleted, filled the end caps with seasonally appropriate holiday dreck, and cleaned up a spill in aisle 7, where a customer had opened a file of pixie dust. After 20 minutes, he came back to the register. "Want me to look after the shop today?" he asked. "You look like you could use a day off." The master's eyes shot daggers at him. He took a breath to volley some sharp-tongued reply, then stopped, closed his eyes, and let out a long sigh. "Aye," he said at last. Perhaps that's best." He pushed himself out of the chair and went to the register, where he pulled out a quartz crystal and set it on the counter. It was about 5 centimeters tall, mounted on a broad, round base, and had no cracks, cloudy spots, or inclusions. The old man placed his hand over the crystal and muttered a few words under his breath, and a soft yellow glow began to emanate from it. "If anyone asks for me personally, have a look there," he said. "If it's green, I'll see them. If it's yellow, I'm not available." John nodded. "Yes, sir. I hope you feel better." The old man grunted and left without another word. The other shops in the mall opened mostly at 9, and within an hour John was tending to a steady stream of customers. Most of them were casual holiday shoppers, looking for nothing more magical than a singing reindeer statue. About one patron in 10 purchased something more powerful, an enchanted costume, or a protection amulet, or the old man's specialty, a transformation potion. For these items, John was careful to show the customer the directions and walk them through all the steps, precautions, and provisos. Magic did have rules, but these rules often seemed random and nonsensical to those who weren't trained in the underlying theory. And spells for use magic items, for reasons even John didn't fully understand, were more random than most. All he could do was give the customer the directions and stress the importance of following them. Whatever happened to them after that was on their own head. And then there were the handful of serious practitioners who came to the shop. These folks knew exactly who they were dealing with, and they greeted John with a wink and a nod as they stepped inside. Word had gotten out to the wizarding community about the intelligence ministry's little witch hunt, and they were overwhelmingly on the old man's side. John wasn't sure how they found the shop, since the entrance moved to a new location every night, but he noticed that these men and women were taking home significantly more supplies than usual. Many of the items they bought now were rare and expensive, things that the master could sell at markups of 5 to 10 times the wholesale price. At checkout, they shook John's hand and wished him good luck. "Happy holidays to you too, Millie." The stream of customers tapered off around midday, so John put up the "will return" sign and went out to get lunch. The mall had a food court, of course. John got in the line for Borsa Hut and, with nothing else to do, started people-watching. It didn't take long to find some worthy viewing. A striking Southmoran woman sat near the center of the food court, sipping idly at a hot beverage of some kind. She was older than John, maybe in her mid-30s, but that suited his taste just fine. She sat half-reclined on the bench with her feet propped up on the opposite chair, exposing long legs and calf-high leather boots. She wore skin-tight jeans and a thin, fuzzy sweater of sage green, which made a lovely contrast to her tumble of copper-red curls. The woman noticed John was watching her. She smiled. John smiled back and gave her a respectful nod. She raised her eyebrows, still smiling, and took another sip of her drink. John continued scanning the room, not wanting to seem creepy. His attention kept drifting back to the redhead, though, and after a while he found himself observing her out of the corner of his eye. As the line passed closer to where she sat, John felt a sudden, familiar tingle in his arcane senses. The unmistakable sensation of one mage's aura brushing up against another's. His eyes went wide. With a moment's concentration, he opened up his wizard's sight, then looked back in the woman's direction. A shimmering trail of emerald green light snaked across the floor between them, ending at the fingertips of one elegant hand. She winked at him, then deliberately looked away. The trail of mana drew back into her aura, which glowed with the same emerald light. John was floored. What the redhead had done was the magical equivalent of tracing her hand down his back in a crowded dance club. Not quite a personal violation, but still shockingly forward. He looked away, blushing, and wondered what he should do. By the time he got to the front of the line, John had forgotten what he planned to order in the first place. Flustered, he picked the first combo meal on the menu, put down some cash, and sat down at a nearby booth to wait for his order to come up. It wasn't long before he felt that same brush against his aura again. He whipped his head around in the direction of the touch, saw a ribbon of mana weaving around his back, spun in the other direction, and looked straight up into the dazzling green eyes of the woman. John's mouth opened, but no sound came out. All his charm, all his usual composure in dealing with the opposite sex, failed him utterly. The woman placed one hand flat on the table before him and leaned casually into his space, looking down at him with an amused smile. It made John feel both very small and terribly aroused. Her aura pressed closely against his own, and the contact was like a sizzle of electricity. Not only was she a practitioner, she was a strong one, maybe as strong as the old man. "Mind if I join you, love?" Her voice was rich and bright, and carried just a hint of a Southmoran accent. "Please," John stammered. "Oh, gods," he thought. "Oh, gods. A hot redhead is coming on to me. Don't fuck this up, don't fuck this up, don't fuck this up." The woman slid into the booth beside him, increasing the contact between their auras. With great effort, John reined in his own magic, closing down his aura as much as he could, the magical equivalent of crossing his legs and wrapping his arms around his body. For her part, the woman kept her aura open, inviting contact, though she did not extend it into his personal space again. "What's your name?" she asked. John looked down at his hands, flat on the table in front of him. John Tunstall." He glanced back up, and the woman smiled again. At this close proximity, it was even more dazzling. Below those emerald eyes, he could see a generous smattering of tiny freckles across her cheeks, which stood out against her pale skin. They were the same color as her coppery hair. "I'm Esme," she said, reaching out and covering his hand with her own. "I've been looking for you, John." "Oh, gods," he thought again. "Looking for me? Why?" A terrifying thought struck him, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "Are you with Imperial Intelligence?" Esme laughed, a sensual and wicked sound. "Oh, no, no," she said. "Stars above, that would be a fine thing, wouldn't it? No, dear, I'm not with the imps. I saw you in a vision." This was not such an incredible statement to John as it would have been to most people. After all, he was apprenticed to a master wizard who saw visions of the future almost constantly, but he was still unsure whether to accept it. On the one hand, he was prone to be suspicious of older adults and their motives. Even if she spoke the truth, she might be trying to con him in some way. On the other hand, he told himself, how often does a woman this hot take an interest in you? Seize the day, Johnny. "Yeah?" he said, trying to sound as relaxed and casual as she looked. "And what did you see us doing in this vision?" Esme's smile took on a lascivious cast. "Well, you know prophecy. There are a lot of different paths we might take, different options to explore." She wrapped her lips sensuously around the word options. "All I know for certain is that we meet here, we talk, and then I come back with you to your shop." Options. The word engendered a dozen delicious fantasies in John's testosterone-addled mind. The suspicious part of John's mind was rapidly ceding ground to the seize the day faction. But what would the master think of the idea? John knew the old man was at least as dirty-minded as he was. He'd watched plenty of clueless college students wander into the shop as frat boys and wander out again as big-breasted co-eds. But as much as the old man loved beautiful women, he arguably loved money even more. He would not want John to miss an afternoon of the holiday shopping season because he was boinking Esme in the back office. John pressed his lips together, thinking hard. "I have to get back to work soon," he said, "but I'll show you where the shop is. Come back at 9 when we close and I'll let you in. Deal?" Esme seemed to consider it, her eyes going distant. At last she let out a sharp exhalation, too forceful to be a sigh, and smiled again. "Well, I suppose waiting a few more hours won't do any harm. You've got a deal, Mr. Tunstall." Soon thereafter, the Borsa Hut employee called his number, and John retrieved the bag with his lunch. He gestured invitingly to Esme, and the redhead followed him out of the food court. When they reached the shop, Esme let out a bark of laughter. She stopped and put her hands on her hips, taking in the sight. "Well, this was not what I expected." She shook her head, still chuckling. "Oh, stars, you must hate it. Look at all that nonsense." She spread her hands, encompassing the window displays. John stopped and looked at her, surprised. "You know the owner?" He'd been about to say his master's name, but given the warrant out for his arrest, that wasn't a good idea. Esme's expression grew distant again, and vaguely unsettled. "I did once," she said softly, "as much as anyone can know him." John made an educated guess. "You were his apprentice." Esme's lip twisted into something half amused and half regretful. "I suppose I was." She was silent for a time, scanning over the window displays, fondness warring with grief in those brilliant green eyes. Finally, John cleared his throat. "I do have to open the shop again," he said apologetically. "Did you want to come in and have a look around?" The redhead shook herself, then turned her smile on John once more. "No, that's all right. I wouldn't want to be a distraction. Go tend to your business, and I'll be back tonight." She stepped in close to him and planted a kiss on his cheek. "Don't let the shop leave without me," she said, a playful sparkle in her eyes. John blushed again and smiled back. "I won't," he promised. For the rest of the day, John could barely keep his mind on his work. His thoughts kept returning to Ismay and his fantasies for the night to come. He thought about going upstairs to tell the old man about Esme's arrival, but surely he must have already foreseen it. Maybe that was why he'd seemed so distracted this morning. From their brief conversation, John had guessed that the two hadn't parted on the best of terms. John left his master to his privacy. He had no doubt that if the old man wished to discuss the matter, he would show himself. At 9:05, a knock came on the door of the shop. John looked up and saw Esme peering in around one of the window displays. He smiled and waved her in, but she shook her head and pointed to the door. Puzzled, John came out from behind the counter and pushed it open for her. "Hey, he began, sticking his head out to look at her. Esme grabbed his head in both hands and drew him into a passionate kiss. All John's higher brain functions ceased as the beautiful redhead drew him outside and pressed him up against the display window. Her lithe, supple body pressed against him from chest to groin, and he felt himself growing instantly hard. His arms snaked around her body of their own accord, grabbing hold of her shapely ass and holding her tight. Gods, how he wanted this woman. After a kiss that seemed to go on for minutes, Esme finally came up for air. She moved her mouth to his ear and said, in a husky voice, "Hello again, lovely. Were you a good boy? Did all your work before you play?" "Yes, ma'am," John gasped. Esme nibbled on his earlobe. "Good. I've been looking forward to this for hours." She grabbed his hair at the back of his head and pulled, exposing his throat. She traced a line of kisses and love bites down the exposed flesh, driving John wild with desire. He started kissing every bit of her exposed skin that he could reach, while his hands roamed over the curves of her body. As he did so, John's aura reached out as well. It wasn't something he directed consciously, but a subconscious reaction to his desire. John wanted to feel every part of Esme, with every one of his senses, and that included the arcane. Her aura was wide open to him, inviting, and his own aura wrapped around her like a blanket, enveloping her magic with his own. As soon as this magical encirclement was completed, Esme started moving him again. She tugged him toward the door of the shop, and he followed willingly. She spun him around again, so his back fetched up against the door, and it took him a moment of awkward fumbling to get it open. The bells hanging from the door jangled loudly as they tumbled inside. Esme broke off the kiss and cast a quick look around the shop. A triumphant grin broke out across her face, and she squealed in delight. "Yes!" she cried, and kissed him again. As distracted as he was, a tiny part of John's mind vaguely registered that this reaction might be important. What is it?" he asked, breathlessly. "Tell you later," Esme said, reaching down to tug at the front of his jeans. "Back room, now." John didn't need to be told twice. They stumbled, giggling like teenagers, to the back door of the shop, then across the warehouse floor to the smaller, quieter rooms in the back. This was where the shop's break room was located, as well as a set of general-purpose rooms where the master dabbled in arcane research. The break room had a long wooden dining table taking up much of the floor space. Esme hopped up and sat on the edge of it, which would put her at a very convenient height when John stood in front of her. She wrapped her arms around his back and kissed him again, then traced a finger down the front of John's shirt. She poked a fingertip into the text printed there. "Well, John," she said, playfully, "how about you drop everything and work on my problem?" John laughed and helped Esme pull off her sweater, casting it aside. Her lovely freckles continued across her breastbone and the upper curves of her breasts. "Well, you know what they say," he said, as he reached around behind her to unclasp her bra. "The customer is always right." A cold, harsh voice came from directly behind him. "I have never said that in my entire life." John's blood abruptly ran cold. He spun around and saw his master, the wizard Artax, glaring up at him from the break room door. He had left his hat upstairs, and his broad, high forehead shone under the fluorescent lights. His bright blue eyes were narrowed in tightly controlled anger. "Master," John stammered, "I didn't leave the shop untended. Everything's locked up." The master held up a hand to silence him. John let himself be silenced. Artax, he now realized, was not glaring at him, but past him. John stepped to the side, clearing the space between the old man and Esme. The redhead seemed completely untroubled by the fact that she was sitting half naked on a table in the master's shop. She gave him a casual wave, that triumphant light shining in her eyes again. "Nice ward you got there," she said. "I like how you keyed it specifically to my aura signature. It's like a hand-lettered sign saying, 'Keep out, Ismay.' Quite the personal touch. Obviously, it's still vulnerable to a jacketed aura exploit, but I guess they didn't have those in your day. Still, points for effort." Artax grunted, a sound that came out as almost a growl. When he spoke, the words were low, even, and pronounced with deliberate precision. "Esmeralda Rose Freebairn, what have you done to my apprentice?" "Nothing," Esme said, innocently. Her eyes drifted back to John, and her tongue flicked quickly over her teeth. "Well, nothing yet." "Master Tunstall has quite enough to worry about without you complicating his existence even further," Artax said. Esme laughed once, and this time there was acid in it. "Oh yes, you're quite good at complicating people's lives all by yourself, aren't you?" I have enough blame to carry for my own choices," the old man snapped. "I shan't accept blame for the choices of others." Esme spread her hands. This coincidentally put her breasts on display, which made it hard for John to focus on what she was saying. "And I'm not asking you to. I'm not here to place blame. In fact, I'm here to say the words every parent longs to hear." She put her hands together again, lacing her fingers as if in supplication. Her face took on an expression of overwrought earnestness. "I need you, Mother. You're the only one who can help me." Esme and Artax stared at each other. The silence that followed was so heavy and so filled with tension that it took John 5 whole seconds to realize what she'd said. "Wait a minute," he said. "Mother?" And that's the end of part 1. Come back tomorrow evening, and I will read you guys part 2 of this story. Until then, have fun, and keep it on the bright side.